With that, John, I'll hand it over to you and we'll hear about mobile money in Africa.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for the generous introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. I know it's the time of the year where we're all feeling cold and sorry for ourselves, so thank you for coming along, and thank you to the African Studies Centre for having me. In a lot of my work in different countries in Africa, I quite often hear people refer to this centre, so it's a real honour to be able to talk to you today. So I'm going to be talking to you about bridge contracts. And what I mean by that is the contracts that firms need to build agent networks into rural areas of Africa and other developing regions, whether that's to provide clean energy, clean drinking water, mobile money, an Uber for tractor sharing service. And this comes because, well, my interest in this area comes because I'm a lawyer by training, but now my expertise is contract theory, how to write better contracts. So I've been thinking, well, how, when firms want to expand, most of them use agents. And I've been thinking, well, one of the reasons some of these projects might not be working very well is the contracts don't work well. So can we use interpretive contract theory to study these contracts and see if we can help them function better? So today I will be talking about mobile money and the contracts that underpin M-Pesa in Kenya, which, and I'm sure you've all heard of M-Pesa, but I'm going to do a basic introduction. This is part of a very long-suffering book project, and the book is 2.5 years overdue, and I can't use COVID as an excuse for much longer, and I'm concerned the publisher is going to write to me any day now saying it's over.
John, couldn't you use as an excuse the birth of children?
I don't know if they really care about that either. They really care. Not after 2.5 years. You can use that for 6 or 9 months.
Paid attention to the kids and got your priorities right.
That's what I'm hoping. That's what I'm hoping. So I'm going to talk about bridge contracts and what I mean by that. I'm going to introduce M-Pesa and the challenge that cash merchants have with managing their liquidity, problems to solve, and then how the M-Pesa contracts solve those problems, and then implications for other services like Hello Tractor. So my basic argument is that a lot of the leapfrogging literature that I think Mark was referring to is this idea that if firms have the right technology, everything's going to magically take off. And what I want to argue is actually, if we study the systems that have had some success in expanding into rural areas, particularly in M-Pesa, we'll see that technology is part of it, but contracts are really important. And people don't bother studying the contracts for a bunch of reasons, which I'll talk about later.
There you go.
Oh, sorry, there was just a lag.
There's latency.
Yeah, there was latency. Okay, so I just want to paint some really broad brushstrokes now. So these are some mass generalizations, but I just need to make them to then get to what bridge contracts are. So we all know about challenges firms face when they want to provide services in rural areas of Africa. Bad infrastructure, poverty, gender norms tend to become more discriminatory. These are broad trends. And what interests me is, okay, so we have these barriers. And I think maybe I need to be a little bit closer for this to work. Or should I try the pad?
The pad tends to work well.
First, I clicked on this and the next one came.
Stick with the pad. Just hope I don't have to go backwards.
Now let's see it stepping back stops the pad.
No, I mean, I hope I don't have to go back to a previous slide. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I've been talking to a lot of donors, and I say, well, donors spend $44 billion a year trying to help firms provide financial services to rural communities. 44 billion. And 1.3 billion people still don't have access to formal financial services. So this is just financial inclusion. This doesn't count the billions of dollars spent trying to provide clean energy, clean drinking water, all these other services. And I've been thinking, why are these programs not working well? Why are some of these programs not working very well? And some donors are just starting to face up to the fact that these programs aren't working well and started thinking about alternatives. So this was a blog from what I think is from who I very think is brave, a brave World Bank guy from 2020, saying we need better research methods to understand why a lot of our programs aren't working very well. And so I spent a lot of time studying agent networks and contracts for different services. So this is me, and that's me on the left-hand side in Ghana in 2023, about 12 months ago, when I was studying the contract between Vodafone and its mobile money agents. And I've done a lot of thinking about this and thought, well, hold on. I think there's two fields of research we can use to try to develop the new thinking that donors seem to be wanting. One of them is contract theory. So we have contracts between firms and their agents. Contract theory is very well established in the developed world. Nobel Prizes, US government, a whole bunch of other governments have used insights from contract theory to write better contracts between firms, between the firm and governments. And I've been thinking, why don't we harness that for the purpose of financial and economic inclusion, but also network theory? Because it seems to me that contracts are important to helping firms expand, and it seems to me they tap into pre-existing networks. So I'm teaching network theory this term. Goodness knows how it's going to go because I'm teaching it. I've had to teach it myself. I don't have any training in that. But it's actually quite handy because a lot of the best pioneers in contract theory live in our city. And so I communicated with both these guys about bridge contracts, and I was going to hold a book workshop later this year with Oliver Hart was going to attend, but I need more data from Kenya, so I need to push that book workshop back. So just to round out this introduction, this is the portfolio of firms with whom I'm either running research projects now or developing research projects. As Mark mentioned, this is one of my favorites. I think setting up an Uber for tractor service is really interesting, and I'm in touch with, I had some funding to work with them, but then the funder unfortunately went bankrupt, which was a real bummer, partly for my summer funding. That was 6 months of summer funding, which vanished, but more importantly, the project vanished. But what I'm going to talk to you today about the bridge contracts that M-Pesa has developed in Kenya. Because as I'm sure you know, M-Pesa was really the pioneer of building agent networks, and most other firms have built on their initial insights. So my thinking is go to the source. So the idea of bridge contracts is that, like I said, we know about these barriers and everyone's talked about them for long periods of time. But what interests me is how do firms adapt to these barriers? Because I think a lot of donors are acting like a doctor that prescribes medication without studying the patient. This is how firms need to expand. And I say, how do you know how firms need to expand when you haven't studied what firms are actually doing? Step one, study the symptoms of the patient and then propose medication. You might not even need medication after all. And so I study the ways in which some firms seem to have circumvented these problems, at least partially and at least in some places. And it seems to me that if we study these systems, their purpose is to expand markets. And what do I mean by that? By that, I mean that a lot of contract theory and a lot of regulation is premised on the idea that the market is already formed. And this is where I think a lot of regulation is going wrong, because a lot of policymakers say we need to regulate these products by doing X, Y, and Z. And if you study the regulation, it seems to me this is regulation for markets that are already up and running. But if firms want to expand, they need to be able to experiment, trial and error, build, expand markets. That requires different types of contracts and different types of policy. And so these bridge contracts and the systems they form seem to have, and this is early stage research, but they seem to have three broad principles. One, decentralized systems. So the firms delegate a lot of jobs to these agents. The firms don't want to do very much themselves sitting in the head office in the capital city. Second, there are lots of contracts, many rules, but very flexible. So a lot of contractual forgiveness. You're meant to do A, B, and C. We all know that you're not doing B, but we're not going to cancel the contract or sack you or take you to court. We're going to be flexible. We're going to work together over time. And the third, it seems, tap into local networks. So these seem to be, to me, the three key features of a bridge system, and the contracts support this process, which I'll explain today. So my claim is that Safaricom built its cash merchant network using this sort of system. And the Central Bank of Kenya might say, well, why bother? Well, what's important is the policy that supported this. So the Central Bank of Kenya allowed Safaricom to build this sort of system. This is quite different to a normal firm. A firm wouldn't do it largely hierarchical, so most are top down. Firms often use less flexible contracts, and tapping into local social networks is less important. So it was very important to have flexibility to come up with this type of organizational arrangement. Might say, why bother spending years and years and traveling around studying these bridge contracts? Because I think if we want more inclusion, we need to try to recreate the circumstances that enabled this type of organization to grow. So rather than assuming we've got markets that are already formed and we can use policy for markets that are formed, if we want firms to expand, at least in relation to their expansion, we need to maybe return to some of the original policy environment that the CBK used in Kenya. So, cash merchant liquidity. So now I'll explain M-Pesa as a case study for this argument. Now, I'm sure most of you know about M-Pesa. I think anyone who works in development has at least heard of it. It's defined in a whole bunch of ways, a lot of which I think are really unhelpful and get people very confused. So for the sake of my presentation, when I talk about mobile money, and M-Pesa is an example of mobile money, I mean an account with a mobile phone company that does the same basic functions as a bank account. You can deposit money, store it in there, transfer money, take it out again. They're the 4 functions of a bank deposit, and that's what an M-Pesa account does. Usually you don't deposit and withdraw money through a branch like you would with a bank. You do so through one of these cash merchants that I was talking about. So the context for building M-Pesa, so like I said, I wanted to go back to the source. And the source is 81% of people didn't have a bank account. So people tended to transfer money through this type of bus-based system. So if this bus is going to where my grandma lives in a rural area of Kenya. I give money to the bus driver in an envelope with some extra that's in cash form, and I just hope that he takes it to the bus depot in the rural area where my grandma lives, and I hope she will get it. You can imagine all sorts of problems with this. Costly, risky, generally unreliable, but that was what most people tended to use. Then mobile money hits, M-Pesa hits, launched in 2007, becomes huge because people can transfer money electronically. So now when I'm sending money to my grandma, I just send this money to her and she receives it instantaneously. She can tell me that it's arrived instantaneously. Generally, this is going to be a very useful innovation. So it grows rapidly throughout Kenya. And so I've been thinking, okay, everyone talks about the technology, and the technology is really useful, but cash still needs to go into this mobile money system and out again. And this is still really important because of very high levels of cash use, even in Kenya. And I say even in Kenya because Kenya is a poster child for mobile money, and cash is still used a lot. And it's used much more in the developing world, in other parts of the developing world. So I've been thinking, how did they build this cash merchant network? And by cash merchants, what I mean are these are corner stores, petrol stations, retail outlets that operated as independent contractors for Safaricom. So by independent contractors, what I mean is Safaricom did not hire these people as employees. They were instead independent contractors, almost like not consultants, but if that helps you to think through in terms of contractors, independent organizations with whom you have a contractual relationship. And this system needed to be huge to work. So Michael Joseph, the CEO of Safaricom, said, we thought that we need agents on literally every corner in every village. And now there's 180,000 cash merchants, including in many of the most remote parts of Kenya. Now, some of you, particularly those who know about M-Pesa in Kenya, will know that Safaricom had a lot of, let's say, unique advantages. It was the first mover. It had so many mobile phone customers who could easily cross-sell mobile money to these mobile phone customers. Also, it had a lot of people who would sell airtime, mobile phone credit on behalf of the firm. So it had a lot of advantages. But what I'm going to argue later on is, even though that means that Kenya is a unique example, the policy environment and the contract are actually quite similar in a handful of other countries, which suggests that we can at least extrapolate a little bit based on what happened in Kenya. And part of the reason that I'm looking at this is that there's still a long way to go even in Kenya. So if you look at this map, there's a lot of mobile money agents in the green areas, but very few in the red and almost none in the white. So there's interest even within Kenya to say, how can we build more extensive, more liquid cash merchants, even in Kenya? And in other countries in Africa, there's agents or cash merchants are overwhelmingly clustered in urban and semi-urban areas. women are also underrepresented as agents. So there's a lot of interest amongst donors to say, how can we improve the operation of these systems to reach more people and better involve women? And so that's part of where I'm hoping this research will ultimately go. Again, by studying what the firm's doing first. So this idea of better research methods, does my work, does it actually contribute to building better research methods? I really hope so. So what I'm going to do is argue that generally existing explanations for the growth of the M-Pesa agent network focus on technology. Everyone had a mobile phone, isn't that great? Individual techniques, so some people say they had an interesting commission structure, which really worked brilliantly. And a lot of people say, well, all other countries should copy Kenya's regulation. And I'm going to argue that all three of those approaches are short-sighted once we study the microdynamics of the contracts. So it's the contracts, just the words on the page, but also it's the norms, the informal norms which emerged around the page. Because contracts solve two problems. They provide set rules for us, but they also provide a framework for a whole bunch of informal understanding to emerge over time. So say, for example, those of us who work in Boston University, we all have a contract with the provost that says we'll do X, Y, and Z. We probably didn't read all of the contract, but we probably took note of the basics. I'm going to get paid X. My tenure track period, which I'm very mindful of, is going to be 6 years. But then there's a bunch of fluffy stuff which emerges around the contract that we just do. So when the dean says, okay, we're going to have an extra faculty call on this day, or we're going to have faculty retreat on this day, you just come. So there's norms that emerge around the contract, and we need to understand both. But the contract creates a framework for those norms to grow over time. And some might say, understandably, why should we take any notice of these contracts? Because let's face it, who actually reads contracts? Very few of us. Or reads all of our contracts. But actually, when you talk to Safaricom, Safaricom says, we complied with the contracts. Because the Central Bank of Kenya said, we're not going to design regulations specifically, we'll allow you to use your contracts to provide this service, but we are going to check whether you comply with them. So if we get phone calls from customers saying an agent's done X, Y, and Z, and we look at your contract, and your contract says that actually agents or cash merchants will only do A, B, and C, you're in trouble. So Safaricom trained cash merchants in how to honor their contract. And also Vodafone, the Vodafone head office, because Vodafone owned Safaricom at the time, Vodafone wanted Safaricom to comply with these contracts too, because Vodafone was worried about money laundering that might come through this new payment system. So there was a lot of pressure coming from London on Safaricom to comply. So compliance, whilst we can never quantify it, is more than I think a lot of us might imagine. So there is some value in understanding the specific rules that came out of these contracts. And I'm going to argue that the contracts created a decentralized system. And in this case, Vodafone or Safaricom delegated a lot of jobs to the cash merchants. It was flexible. So as Michael Joseph said himself, no one was prepared for the success of M-Pesa. They were all winging it, to put it politely. They were all just floundering along, working out this system as it grew. So it was very flexible. And it tapped into pre-existing networks. And this is going to be my next generation of research, which I'll hopefully do in August. And so that's, and the policy side, like I argued at the start about the way these bridge systems form, the Central Bank of Kenya provide principles-based regulation. So what I mean by that is the Central Bank of Kenya said, we're not going to design specific regulation. We are going to use a letter of no objection. We're going to give you a letter of no objection. And it says, so long as you comply within the phrase, provide, quote, adequate protection of customers' funds, go nuts, as we say in Australia. Go and give it a try. And so this gave Safaricom great freedom to trial different contracts. And so I'll talk about that. And that was market-making contract. It wasn't markets that currently exist. It enabled them to build markets. And that's what I'm arguing we need to return to if we're going to have meaningful expansion. So now I'm going to talk about two sets of contracts in two broad stages. One of them is from 2007 when M-Pesa was first launched to 2010. And that was when the system was very new. So everyone was floundering a lot. Then I'll talk about 2010 onwards when Safaricom had a bit more of an idea about how to expand. and they develop new contracts. So what I'm going to try to do is summarize about 3 weeks of my contracts class in about 4 slides. So if on this works, it says a bad thing about my classes, actually, if I can explain it in 4 slides. So basically the idea is contracts try to solve 3 main problems that arise when people want to work together. One is uncertainty. We don't know what the future is going to hold. So that means we can't design a contract that perfectly outlines what we will all do forever. So say you ask Siri, is it going to snow in an hour? She can say there's a 70% chance. If you say to Siri, is it going to snow in 9 days? She says, I don't know. Because there's a point where we can't predict the future. So we can't write a contract that perfectly allocates what we're going to do. So instead we design contracts that try to work out ways to fill in the blanks. So in our employment contract, there'll be a phrase, something like, you will teach an average of X number of hours a week and provide reasonable service to students and provide, probably reasonable support to other staff. That's because we don't know how to perfectly support staff or support students. So we use a broad term that enables our relationship to emerge over time. So once you come and you get to know the students and they say, Mark, I've got all these problems, you can say, okay, I provide reasonable service. So in this situation, I should do X. Whereas in my circumstance, when dealing with a student that comes along in 6 years' time, I will do Y. So contracts provide us with this flexibility to deal with situations that emerge over time. The second is inadequate effort. So this is probably the more hard-nosed part of contracts, which is how do we ensure that people who we're transacting with actually do their job properly? So again, coming to our employment contract, there's provisions in there saying you're going to be paid X amount. You're going to be up for review at certain points in time. There might be teaching, well, there are teaching evaluations. These are ways to provide incentives for us to actually do our jobs. So uncertainty is what should our deal look like? The second one is how do we create incentives so we actually comply with our deal? And the third is how do we build infrastructure for market activity? So we need roads, we need IT, we need payment systems, we need desks, we need chairs. This is the infrastructure, the scaffolding. Now, my romantic goal is to try to apply contract theory to Africa. And from what I've seen, most contract theorists ignore this third part. There's an assumption that roads work, that courts work, that schools work. And for those of us who work in development, of course, we know that's often not the case, particularly in rural areas. So a contract needs to adapt to these 3 jobs, not just the 2 jobs that contract theorists normally think of. And interestingly, if you can allow me to be a contracts nerd for a couple of slides, if you study the contracts respond to each of these problems. And that's why I argue it builds a bridge system. It adapts to these problems. So here we go. These are the contracts that I've studied. One is, and I could talk for hours on these slides alone, but I won't. But basically, a couple of key points is they're highly flexible. So there's an idea that when building a bridge system, no one knows what it should look like. So our contracts need to be flexible. And that's going to be really important later on because I'll argue that policy needs to allow the contracts to be flexible. If regulation says you've got to provide this service perfectly and your contracts need to be really fixed and everyone complies, firms won't expand. So there's really important that allow firms to adapt to uncertainty. Next is inadequate effort. Now, these are actually references to the contracts. That what's interesting, at least in my opinion, is this second bullet point, which says the incentives for cash merchants to do a good job, in this case, store enough liquidity. So what I'm exploring here is Safaricom create incentives for its agents or its cash merchants to store enough e-money and cash in their till. Because if these cash merchants run out of liquidity, people won't be able to deposit and withdraw money. It's kind of like an ATM that says out of order. You know how annoying that is when you really need cash and you walk 6 blocks to your bank because you want to save $3, and then it says this ATM is out of order. Well, if these cash merchants continually say to customers, I don't have enough cash for you to withdraw from your mobile money account, or I don't have enough e-money for you to withdraw from your mobile money account, you can't transact. Eventually, people will stop using M-Pesa. So how did they solve this problem? 1, they needed to help the cash merchants adapt to uncertainty. 2, they needed to create incentives for the cash merchants to try to do a good job. to try to maintain liquidity levels. And I talk to a lot of people who say, let's design RCTs and trial different commission structures. And one of the many things I want to say, but I don't because I don't know how well it's going to go down, is to say, if you study the system first, you see the incentives come from so many more places than just commissions. And it's really simplistic to say, if we do this, the system's going to grow. Firstly, because they've also got to adapt to this problem. Secondly, the incentive structures come from so many places. So we'd have to think a lot more holistically about how to build these systems further. And last is what's interesting is the firm requires the cash merchants to provide a lot of the infrastructure. So if you look at the contracts, cash merchants have to provide a computer, they've got to provide an internet, they've got to provide a printer. So it's this idea of decentralization. The firm doesn't go out and transfer money to people. The firm doesn't send printers out. The firm delegates that job to local actors living in the community. Now, this system worked okay-ish, but there were still high levels of illiquidity. And so another point of the argument with building a bridge system is they have to evolve over time. I really don't like using silly sayings, but just allow me to use one now. Rome wasn't built in a day, and yada yada. These systems, it's so hard to transplant these systems across countries, particularly transplant policy that should, inverted commas, build these systems, because they have to evolve over time. And if you study, what I think is particularly interesting is what happened when these cash merchants kept running out of illiquidity. Safaricom introduced another bridge actor, and these are called aggregators. So if these are corner stores and petrol stations, these are usually supermarkets, fast-moving consumer goods companies, and these also stored e-money and cash in their server. Now, these aggregators supported the cash merchants in various ways. So if the cash merchant says, I keep running out of cash or I keep running out of e-money, it takes me too long to go to the nearest bank because banks are so far away or the queues are too long, I can just go down the street to this supermarket and I can rebalance my reserves with the supermarket, because the supermarket is also is a new type of cash merchant. So this system evolved over time. Now, of course, in my very formulaic ex-lawyer way, I say, well, hold on, they have the same problems to solve. How can you make sure that the supermarket stores enough e-money and cash? How does the supermarket predict how much e-money or cash it's going to need tomorrow, next week, 6 months' time? Uncertainty again. How does Safaricom create incentives for the supermarket to try to keep its liquidity levels up? And lastly, how do we create infrastructure at that local level? So at the end result, how to create a bridge between money stored in banks, because all money in Safari, in the M-Pesa system was stored in banks. How do we create a bridge that goes all the way to customers? Cash merchants are part of it, and so are aggregators. So what have I done? Studied the contract with aggregators. And again, without going into it in detail, happy to come back to this slide, is there's many goals, there's many provisions to solve that problem as well. So one of them, which I'll just highlight for now, which some of you might find interesting, is that actually the contract says it's going to be an aspirational goal. You will try to have enough e-money and cash in your reserves. The provision says that almost word to word. It says you will have sufficient liquidity to honor all customers' requests to deposit withdraw. So what's basically saying is it's a team effort. It's actually your job, but then the norm that emerges around it is we're going to work together to try to make sure you've got maximum liquidity in your system. Again, I won't walk through the details. I can come back to this slide, but what's interesting once again is the incentives for these aggregators to do a good job come far beyond commission structure alone. The technology is actually part of the incentive structure. So what Safaricom says is, we will give you a SIM, but if you do a bad job, we'll take the SIM away. So the commission structure is one of the incentive sets, but also this access to the technology is an incentive too. And also we can kick you off at any time. So remember the bridge system where I was talking about weak roads and long distances? This solves a number of problems. One, the bank doesn't need to try to transfer money to these organizations, so it doesn't need to deal with bad roads. Two, it's very hard to take either these organizations can't take Safaricom to court for breach of contract. Not that they would anyway for all sorts of reasons, or they can't complain to the Central Bank of Kenya that their contract's been terminated. Because the contract says we can terminate you at any time. So it skips courts. You can't you can't have court cases about continually running out of liquidity. And that's got its own problems. There might be power dynamics, and that we can say that that's a problem. But if we just look at the economics of it, this contractual mechanism means that courts are taken out of the equation. So it's less important that you have courts, no courts in a rural area or weaker courts, because you couldn't go to court anyway. And you couldn't argue that the Central Bank of Kenya should take Safaricom to court. And the infrastructure at the micro level, what's interesting in the contract with aggregators is they say you can only be signed up if you sign up 3 of your outlets. So what's interesting about that is 3 of your shops, your sub stores. So that means you're building a network and you're leveraging the infrastructure that exists in that network. Now, don't worry, I'm certainly not going to walk through this, but I just want you to see this diagram to see that this creates a very complex system of money, and there's incentive structures, and there's training, and all sorts of interesting and intricate things are going on, which comes back to my claim that if we want to help these systems expand, we've got to understand them first and how complex they are and how long it takes to build them. You might say, why bother going to all that effort? Next stage of the research will actually involve looking at these, oh, excuse me, do you mind if we go back? Hope this works. I don't think I do. That's okay. We'll just forge on, don't worry. Oh, there we go.
The bottom left.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Good?
Yes, thank you. Perfect. My claim here is, well, okay, why bother mapping out all these contracts? Why bother going back to Kenya later this year to understand the social norms and the economic norms? Because I think the next level of research, and the publisher will not like this, is that there's a whole bunch of informal networks that operate underneath these mechanisms that enable it to work. So you have the contract, you have the informal norms around the contract. Then I think a lot of this transacting goes around pre-existing social and economic networks. And that creates norms that also enable the bridge to emerge between banks and customers. So that's why I'm teaching network theory this term. So I then learn how network theory works and how to apply it. So just 2 implications. One, I think if we're going to solve these problems of large numbers of people without access to mobile money or other forms of financial services, this idea of better research methods, I'm hoping that this sort of research can make us realize, well, at least my opinion, that we need to go back to that market-making contracts, those market-making policies. Because if we have a market that works beautifully here, but there's very little here and there's almost none there, we need new thinking, and we're trying to make markets and expand markets. And so at least thinking in terms of the original Central Bank of Kenya model, so principles-based regulation. One of the, and if you can just allow me to be a contracts nerd again for just a second, one of the things that allowed Safaricom to do was put in its contract 2 things. One, and this still applies in their contract with customers, we are not liable for actions of our cash merchants. So what that meant is, it's your risk if things go wrong. You've got to deal with it, customers, which policymakers can get upset about. But what that did is gave Safaricom freedom to experiment. Because they say, we can experiment, and if something goes wrong, we can't get sued because we're not liable for actions of our cash merchants. I'm not saying it should be like that, but I'm saying that created room for experimentation, adapting to uncertainty. Remember that problem when you talk to Siri. The second is that freedom that Safaricom had allowed the firm to use what's called exclusive contracts. So Mark's a cash merchant of mine. You cannot work with any other mobile money firm, which some people think sounds awful, and maybe from a certain angle it is awful. But what it does is Safaricom then said, I will invest a lot in this relationship. I'll work really hard to make this work because I know I'm not going to lose him to anyone else. Whereas if it's non-exclusive, another mobile money firm can come along in 6 months' time and leverage all the training and all the work I did with Mark, and I lose that. So when I talk to firms, they say with non-exclusive provisions, we don't want to expand because we're going to build this agent network or this cash merchant network out here, go to all this cost, and then another firm will just come along and steal a lot of our cash merchants, which is what started to happen. So what's happened in more recent regulation is regulation came along in 2014 that states that mobile money firms are liable for actions of their cash merchants, and that mobile money firms are not allowed to have exclusive relationships. And that's been copied amongst a whole bunch of countries. And one of my arguments is, why did we do this? And what are the real trade-offs? Because there are real trade-offs. And one of them is that it's a shift, I think it's a shift away from market making. It's more market operation. It's let's make this existing market operate better, query whether those terms actually will. But to the extent they will, this is designed with regulating a market that exists, which may have the unintended consequences of preventing a firm from expanding or building a market. And lastly, I just wanted to mention just very briefly how this might apply to other firms. And I'll just briefly talk about Holly Tractor. So, as I'm sure many of you know, very large numbers of farmers don't have access to tractors. Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, they plow their crops by hand. One of the problems with that is that we have a food shortage in 2060. There's forecasts that suggest the world will face a global food shortage, and that part of it is because of these practices. It also makes it very difficult for farmers to move out of poverty. And so Holly Tractor came along with this idea, well, hold on, if there are tractor owners that don't need their tractors very much, and there are farmers that can't afford a tractor, why don't we connect the dots? Sounds a lot like Uber, right? I don't have a car. Because I'm telling the truth, I can't afford one, but I do occasionally need one. Someone who owns a car says, great, I'll drive it around and I'll essentially rent it out for short-term use, although obviously they'll be driving it. And so they've got a situation where there's a farmer that says, I would like a tractor for short-term use. We have an owner that says, I would like to rent this out for short-term use. And this is the CEO of Holly Tractor, Jahil Oliver, who said, great, we'll provide an app that connects the dots. But, and this goes back to the importance of cash merchants, you still need a human to facilitate this process. So many people are paying in cash, so many people don't trust firms, so many people maybe even need assistance in working out the terms and conditions because maybe they don't read English or French. Or, you would know about these problems more than me. These are challenges. So this agent, she's an agent which is a member, she's a member of this community. And so she goes in and she collects demand. So she talks to tractors, she talks to farmers and says, when are you going to need a tractor? And this farmer says, I'll need one on Thursday. And this farmer says, I'll need one next Monday. And this one says, I'll need one the Thursday after that. She says, right. And then she books the tractor. But she's also got to build this ecosystem. So do you remember me saying there were three problems? Uncertainty, create incentives, and build a system, particularly in communities where the system is weak, as in roads are weak, there's not a lot of Wi-Fi. Her job is also to build this system, work out how these different organizations and people can be paid, work out the best local mechanic, find the way to the nearest petrol station and the fastest route from A to B. So the contract has to solve all those three problems. It was meant to go back, but it went forward, but I think you see my point. So, oh, thank you. So same sort of system that when you study the contracts, there's those three patterns are emerging again. Decentralized systems, many rules, but flexible implementation. So the contracts with these agents say, build a system, very broad, very broad. Talk to farmers you know, find a trusted mechanic. These are flexible implementation. We don't know who you should work with specifically. We don't know which mechanic, which bank. So we're going to decentralize that job to you, and we're going to give you authority to working out how to solve it. And also tap into local social networks. So the contract says, words to the effect of start with farmers you know, go through your pre-existing network, build trust. So they're trying to create incentives for this agent to build this ecosystem. And so consistent with my argument is that for these systems to take off, we've got to create the right policy environment for these bridge systems to evolve. Okay, thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions you can have.
All right, John, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation on something that is cutting edge. It's going to make a difference. We will open it up to questions first here, and then we'll take questions from online. And I hope Maddie will help us manage all of that. I'm going to take advantage of the prerogative of being host to ask a very simple question in all of this, which is a little hard for me to understand when I think about how it all works. And that has to do with not just the technology, but actually the most basic infrastructure that supports these payment systems. When you are out there in rural Kenya or rural Zambia, do you need to have a computer to do this? Do you need to have just a cell phone to do it? You must have internet, I presume, to do it, or can you do it just on a cell phone connection? What are the technological hardware constraints that might limit the broader applicability of these kinds of networks?
So that's interesting. So it depends whether do you mean as a customer or as an agent or both?
Both, but I'm really thinking of the agents.
Okay, so the customer, you can make mobile money payments through a lot of the most basic phones, a lot of the first wave phones, and then obviously it gets faster and faster and easier the more recent phones you're using. But in terms of the cash merchants, and that's why, and it's possible to go, oh, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. But you can see actually the contracts tell us what the cash merchants need. So do you remember there was a slide that said you must have a printer and a access to Wi-Fi? And so that's the idea being that's the infrastructure you need. But there are lots of informal mechanisms that will be the next range of research whereby I think there's some transacting going on by people who don't have access to the full range of technology. And I don't know how. So for example, maybe I'm a cash merchant, I don't have a printer, but my friend down the street does. And so when I need to print my reports and send them back to Safaricom, I walk down to her place and ask her. So I think there's an ideal world where you have access to a printer, because particularly in the first wave, you needed to print off reports, Wi-Fi access, so that you can communicate with the bosses, somewhere to store cash, very important. So preferably a till and preferably a safe. So I've seen
Secure
small
till.
safes. Yeah, I've seen some very small safes where it'll just be a box to store cash. But I think there are informal workarounds where I think there's probably pooling some of those resources. So that's when I talk about tap into local networks, that I think is the next stage of research.
And how profound does the internet coverage have to be, or is it truly just a cell phone for the agents?
Well, I think it's one of those situations whereby the better the internet, the more likely it is to work properly and smoothly. But the first wave managed to get by without access to Wi-Fi. So that's why the contracts were so broad. Remember me talking about them being so broad, because they were saying, we don't know what technology you really need at all times. So if you want to, there are cash merchants. Sorry, do you mind if we go back again? So I still accidentally touching. There are cash merchants that operate with very little of this technology, but I think it's because they leverage technology that others have.
Okay, thank you. Parker Shipton.
This was a really fascinating and well-organized and fast-moving presentation, for which thank you so much on every count. I have about 21 questions, and I've tried to limit them down to about 3. So take your pick. First of all, I think many people in the room and online are probably listening to the presentation with 2 little birdies visiting their ears. One little birdie is basically the voice of Adam Smith or a descendant. The other little birdie is a voice of Karl Marx or a descendant. So one of them is talking about opportunity, the other is talking about exploitation, and you know the rest of the story. Is there room for a voice that they're both going to agree on, or that you don't need either one for? Second, written contracts versus oral contracts. There are some societies, like most of Native America, that say the important contracts are done orally. The writing is what they tried to impose on us, and look how everything has ended up. Third, the map of the distribution of the agents geographically shows basically that it's the very high density areas. It's Kikuyu and Mbumeru, it's Luo, and it's Luya. And it's going spreading outward from there, maybe. But very, very clear that the high density people who are, especially Kikuyu, Gusi, most accustomed to business because they've got to, because that's how they're going to survive. They couldn't survive on those tiny, diminishing farms, just like Igbo in Nigeria, say, for example. Is that not right? Tractors. Tractors have also two little birdies in the ears. One says, this is efficiency. The other says, watch the cost of petrol, and it says, watch the over tillage of thin soils. It's going to erode them when processes like stick planting were more conservationist for the fertility of the soils. Finally, money. I think of titles of books, for example, Sharon Hutchinson's book called Newer Dilemmas, Southern Sudan, Coping with Money, War, and the State, which brings us back to the first question of the two little birdies like Adam Smith and Karl Marx talking about whether money is a good thing out there or maybe not so good. Take a pick.
Yeah.
That's a lot of birdies.
Thank you.
Glad you had a piece of paper to take.
Yeah,
notes
that's
on.
right. Well, very interesting. Thank you. So in terms of the two birdies, is the idea this is a great opportunity, Adam Smith could be saying, but Karl Marx is saying this is going to lead to exploitation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
Oh, by the way, that was the later Adam Smith, not the earlier Adam
Right.
Smith, who had a different, the invisible hand was the one that distributes in
Yes.
the early Adam Smith.
Yes. I haven't delved into that just because it's not my area of research. But one thing I do think is I think that's a very interesting question. Where I have started thinking about this in terms of policy, as in, and this goes back to what I was saying before about existing markets versus expanding markets. So when should a policymaker say, I need to protect agents from mistreatment by the mobile money firm? And that's really tough, I think, when to say, or protect customers from poor service at the agent level. So maybe people start using mobile money and then the agents or the cash merchants all suck and people are left worse off than if mobile money never came. And I think that's a complex question too. So I haven't gone into, so I don't know, but I think, and part of my broader project is to try to understand at the micro level what's happening and then come back to that, which I know is a complete cop out, but it's
That's an anthropological method.
yeah, of course, but
Thank
that's, yeah, but hence trying to look into network theory because I'm trying to understand how does this all play out at the ground level. And what does interest me is that I try to think about whether this is working for cash merchants and customers, just judged by the number of people using it. That's sort of one criteria I'm trying to use. And interestingly, in the first few years of M-Pesa, cash merchants ran out of liquidity all the time. But people kept on using it because they said this is still better than our alternatives. And so I'd be interested in returning to some of those documents to try to understand what experiences did people have, and to what extent were they happy and upset, and where does that leave us in terms of policy. But other than that, I don't know. But I think that's an important question, particularly when it comes to policy. In terms of oral contract, I think that's also very interesting. And like I said, my romantic dream is to set up a research center of some description, a partnership between Boston University and a university on the continent that says, let's apply the seminal ideas from contract theory and see the extent they do apply. Because I don't think that's been done before. So I'm in discussions with some African universities to try to set up a partnership because I'd be interested in better understanding the role of contracts for the cash merchants and more generally. So for example, are people just clicking we all click these contracts. When people sign on to Facebook, there's a box that says, do you accept our terms and conditions? And everyone ticks. And then when Facebook sells all our data, people get annoyed and think, well, you actually signed them away. There was terms and conditions, you clicked it, that's a contract. So I would be interested in exploring to what extent do the cash merchants feel bound by contractual terms? To what extent do cash merchants read even components of these contracts? To what extent is there variation? I'd be really interested in maybe cash merchants in urban areas actually really do read the contracts more, perhaps in rural areas there's no reference to them. And then linking back to your policy point, how does that impact policy? Do we then think outside the box and say, we need more policy protection for people in rural communities because they're likely to be more mistreated? I mean, it sounds crazy, but trying to unpack that idea of to what extent do contracts and their operations vary between urban and rural and frontier communities, and how should policy be tailored to that? The last point about the exploitation of the soil and the environmental consequences. I think
Yeah. Well, I'm back.
Can you read that percent?
I thought perhaps I upset someone by when I was looking at the birdies. I thought maybe someone found that offensive.
But
Just lastly on the, I've been wondering that as well. Is this going to create, well, one of them is also pollution. If you have more tractors doing more stuff,
Fossil
making more
fuels.
pollution. Exactly. So
Air, soil.
yeah. So I don't know what environmental, I mean, he's a pretty liberally minded guy, pretty interested in the environment, my guess. So, but yeah, I haven't studied that part yet. That project unfortunately got put on hold because the funding ran out.
I'll maybe catch you another time.
I'd love that. I'd love to hear the
about-
remaining 17, I think we were left. I seriously love to learn more.
I'll catch you another
Or
time
maybe a class.
about network theory and point to especially the Rose Livingston Institute and Manchester University with Max Gluckman and the other Pommies, which leads to a Vodafone question. Do they need the Pommies over there?
The Brits,
Yeah,
as in, well, you know, it's a British company that's,
hey, the
Yeah.
Vodafone, yeah.
yeah.
And is that just what one of the little birdies is gonna call neo-capitalism or neo-imperialism or something?
Well, I think some people get excited, well, at least some people get excited by M-Pesa because it was a British-owned company, but the London office did comparatively well. Apart from saying comply with contracts because we're terrified about anti-money laundering, it was largely the Safaricom Kenya branch.
So
Run
they
largely
followed the
by-
old British tradition of indirect rule.
Yeah, well, maybe that's what it was.
Got it.
But yeah. But that's, I think, part of the reason some people get excited.
Okay, great. Why don't we go to Dr. Zoli Mali, and then we'll get to Zegea.
Thank you.
I'll reiterate the thanks that have been said already for a fascinating presentation. I'm a South African, not a Kenyan or a West African, so I'll ask with South Africa in mind, knowing, as you said, that M-Pesa is a baby of Kenya, so to speak. And I learned about that, interestingly, in this same room many, many years back. I didn't know about M-Pesa, but South Africa now has e-wallet,
Yes.
has instant cash and
Yes.
everything. You talked about airtime and all the issues that go with that, but I have a quick question about criminal elements. One level going to the, did you call them what, aggregators?
Yes.
With the firms themselves, seeing that there is this exclusivity versus non-exclusivity, you are locked in, and even if they choose to abuse their power on you, you have nowhere to run. Are there any measures that are out there to guard against being, in fact, it connects to the exploitation question, I think, that Parker raised. Another criminal element issue that I have, are there any protective measures for these cash points that are in rural areas? Because, like you mentioned, informal things, I nearly said informal settlements, informal spaces that do what is done by those who are contracted. Is there anything that is done to protect people, because there's a lot of criminality out there?
Sure, great question. So in terms of the exploitation of the aggregate, well, firstly, you aren't allowed to have exclusive contracts in Kenya anymore. So you used to be able to, but then policy changed that. In terms of how they're protected from groups, so you mean, say, for example, an aggregator signs up with Safaricom, then Safaricom treats it poorly or sends in people that's I don't, well, that's when the regulation's important. So now, from what I understand, you can complain to the Central Bank of Kenya. The Central Bank of Kenya imposes various rules about how mobile money firms have to treat their agents and their aggregators. So if news of that hit the CBK, there'd be trouble. And I think the firms, particularly the ones making so much money, they don't want the CBK to do anything more than what it's already doing. And so my guess is that they've got pretty strong incentives to manage their aggregators fairly, particularly now, because if their aggregators say, I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to another firm, that's a problem for the firm. Less of an issue in Kenya, because Safaricom is so dominant that everyone has to work with M-Pesa. I might work with a couple of other mobile money firms, but I'm unlikely to stop working with Safaricom. Whereas in, say, Tanzania, where it's much more competitive, mobile money firms have got a stronger incentive to treat their aggregators well, because there's not one firm that's overwhelmingly dominant and can afford to treat its aggregators poorly. In terms of protection at the ground level for customers, that's also in regulation now. So, which is basic consumer protection rules. Like you've got to treat your customers fairly. There's a complaints line where people can complain to the CBK. And so from what the policy position, which I think was really interesting that the CBK did, was in a developed country, the central bank just wouldn't be that involved. A firm would launch a product. If people do bad things, they get sued in court. So it's private actors solving disputes much more. Whereas with this model, it was allow From my discussions with Safaricom and other mobile money firms, there's a strong incentive to protect customers. Firstly, you don't want to lose them to rival firms. And second, well, there's three actually. Second is regulation. And third, what I think is also emerged at the time is if you treat your customers badly, that goes over the internet so quickly. You know, social media, people will just share stories of, I put 20 shillings into M-Pesa and they only gave me 10 shillings of e-money. That happens enough time, that gets posted on Facebook, Twitter, etc. That's bad news. So I think there's pretty strong incentives from what I gather to make sure your cash merchants do a good job and make sure your customers are served relatively well.
Before you go to him, sorry, can I chip in one more? Language. Are these contracts written only in English or are they translated to languages that people can understand?
That's a good question. And I would like, when I look at the social networks part, when I go back to Kenya in August, I would like to look at that. From what I understand, the first contracts were in English. Remember me saying when Michael Joseph said we had no idea what we were doing? I think or very little. I think the first contract was in English, and then quickly they said, why does no one want to do this? And they realized, well, no one can understand in certain communities. We don't have translators on sale. So they then had to translate a lot of the material into local dialects. I don't know of now any contracts. I don't know of any contracts that are written in the local dialect. From what I understand, it's English, say Kenya, it's English, but the firm has provided translation services. But that's something I'll check, because I think that would be really interesting. Again, coming to that idea of if you want a decentralized system, it's got to be tailored for the specifics of the community. So if you want to decentralize into Wajir, you might have to translate the contract, but maybe you don't need to bother as much if it's in downtown Nairobi. Maybe that's less of a problem. So that's something I'll check. I think that's a really interesting question.
Okay, thank you. I see that we have one online, which we'll get to, but first, we'll get them.
Thank you. When Brother Professor Mark mentioned in his opening remarks about Ethiopia, I was expecting you going to say a few things about Ethiopia, and I'm an Ethiopian American.
Oh, really?
So, and thank you, Professor Reza, about the invisible hand. I was lucky I was trained in Scotland last year, but I know that was School of Economics.
Yeah, of course.
So, I participated there. You also mentioned about as a member of parliament and chairman of the budget committee, there was a kind of restriction by the World Bank for the third world. Sometimes they call them developing, whatever. And about poverty, whenever they mention about poverty, they first said poverty eradication. And then they came with another theory, alleviation. And then they said reduction. Now, you also mentioned about market and firms. So what I want to know is how do you relate what you mentioned for wonderful presentation with governance? I mean, in Africa, dictatorship, there are bad or maladministration. How do you relate with these things? I mean, whatever you say, the contract, and I know the corruption in Kenya, I know the corruption in Ethiopia, I know the corruption in Nigeria, I've traveled there a lot. How do you see these things? How do you connect all of them?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. And also I want to say I'm on the lookout for collaborators. Just to fall in front, one of the things I like living about in this country, you can just be so upfront. So I'm looking for collaborators because I have some partnerships with some firms and some universities, and I'm building some with some universities. But I'm particularly interested in Ethiopia, partly because you know that they've just launched mobile money. Yeah, I'm sure you know that. So I'd be really interested to see how that system evolves. Because Kenya, it happened in 2007 and evolved. How about in a country where they're just launching it? I think that would be amazing because a lot of my data is old, and I'm talking to people who said, okay, yeah, in 2008, I spoke to some cash merchants, and so I'd love to study what happens as it evolves in real time. Second, the question of governance. So that's actually very interesting because that's one of the reasons I got into this work, because I thought we all talk about the problems. Again, corrupt governments or weaker roads, but how do firms adapt to those problems? And what clues does that give us outside, well, to the extent you're an outsider like me, of what we can do about the situation? And what I think is very interesting about Kenya is this system could grow so much despite the major problem with corruption. 2008, which was a year after this was launched, you know, the electoral violence, 1,000 people died, all sorts of problems, but the system just expanded like wildfire. And I think how? Because traditional contract theory would say, this is so unlikely to work because if you can't enforce contracts, no one's going to want to invest a whole lot. The firms did invest a whole lot. And then a lot of contract theory would say, well, you won't build these cash merchant networks because you can't enforce contracts against them. And you probably can't most of the time, but that system worked anyway. Well, worked, sort of expanded. How? So my thinking, and this is just off the top of my head, because I actually want to think more about that topic because I think that's very interesting. So really firms and expansion in context of weak states. I think technology is part of the answer because I think, like I said, you can transfer money from one user to another, and the state could steal that though. I mean, the state could steal your data, or the state could, I guess, steal your money. But I think the central bank of Kenya was really important there. And you would all know this better than me, but I think I've heard anecdotally of some corruption problems amongst the CBK, but I haven't, whatever they are, it wasn't bad enough, I guess, to stop this working. And I think it's almost like the CBK was sort of a substitute. So the national government's got problems and there's electoral violence. The courts may not work beautifully, but we have this central bank that's got a few foibles, but it's driving this. It's keeping an eye on things. And in some of my work in other developing countries, I've found that that's a bit of a pattern. That you talk to people, you talk to firms, and they'll say, the government's really corrupt, we don't like them. They'll say, how about the central bank? They'll say, oh, the central bank's okay. Maybe because a lot of the central banks came along later and the government sort of, we need this to work well, because if inflation goes crazy, we're going to get voted out or there'll be revolution. So let's choose some good people. And then this sort of tradition of broadly complying with the rules emerged. And that's something I'd love to study more. And so I think in this instance, the Central Bank of Kenya could act as sort of like a, not just an umpire, because that would assume the system was set up, but sort of a driver of the system, like help the train to move forward. And so maybe that's a model to think about. We have a central bank driving what's going on and less oversight from the government. And less need for courts. Remember me talking about how these contracts are self-enforcing, and I think that helped. Which then makes it harder if you talk about services where people may need to go to court, because then you bring courts back in.
Thank you.
Interesting. Before we go to one of our online participants, it strikes me that central banks have to deal with other central banks and with international financial institutions. So they have a kind of peer review
Yes, they do.
and a kind of oversight that put them on a different level.
Yes, and yes, and also there's a lot of international fora. I think this is what you're getting at. There's a lot of international fora specifically for central bankers. So one is the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, collection of central bankers and regulators from I think 85 developing countries, and they get together regularly in big conferences. And I suspect that's another mechanism, creating incentives to do your job reasonably well. I don't think they're perfect. There's the challenges, but from what I understand, stronger incentives than a lot of governments or a lot of courts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now we're going to try to go to Suzanne Muller, who's online and has her hand raised. Please unmute.
Okay. Yeah.
Hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you very much for a great talk. I come to you as a fellow traveler, so to speak. I was based in Kenya for 20 years, and I worked for most of the major donors on rural financial services. And I find your theory very interesting, and your Northian difference between formal and informal rules, as well as your doctor-patient analogy, which I thought was a good one. And it's interesting because what you say, although you're speaking about M-Pesa, goes back a long way further than that. It really applies to a good deal of aid, not only in financial services, but development aid in general. And so, I mean, your points about, I mean, you sort of say, well, why is all of this not, are things not happening? And one is, going back to the doctor-patient analogy, is that you need to speak to the right people, but you also need to ask them, what are their problems? And I found in my work that a lot of times, because I was always on missions with lots of other people, I mean, you have to make a connection to the people who not only are the users, but as you said, the providers. And people, in fact, I found are dying to tell others what their problems are, because most people don't ask them, and otherwise they don't listen. So I think that was an excellent point, but it goes back time immemorial. I can think of so many development projects that have failed because nobody listened to the users, and not including the state, not just the donors. And the second is there is, so that's one point I agree with. And then there is actually a lot of information out around, even before you do that. And most of it is not either collecting to or reacting to the information that already exists. And then even if you get those two elements of what you were talking about, then there's the bigger question, which goes back to your Northian theory about, well, sometimes you have a lot of that. And why are people not acting on it? And I don't know if you found this, I'd be interested to know what you found in M-Pesa, but you know, whether it's donors or the states, they all are part of bureaucracies. They have their own bureaucracies. And in bureaucracies, people in bureaucracies are normally rewarded for maintaining the status quo, not for making waves and finding problems. Because I mean, I had this my own experience this way a lot of times. And as you said, there's more of a check on this now because there is social media. So it's not as though you can hide a lot of this sort of stuff. And secondly, I guess another difference in the case of something like M-Pesa is you have a financial institution that is generally well regarded, the central bank. So there's an element of trust, but of course, down the drain, going down the gravy system, the whole line of command, what you do find is even when you do what you were suggesting be done, nothing happens. And I think that goes back to the sort of Northian rule of bureaucratic stasis and the reward, not only the incentive systems within those for not making waves and not dealing with problems. So anyway, I just found it all interesting because it dovetailed with everything I've found for years and years in most countries of Eastern and Southern Africa, and as well as elsewhere in the world. And it's sort of what you're finding to me is a very generic problem. And I found it interesting for that reason. And although I do think, both the presence of social media and the fact that we're dealing with a central bank system that's a kind of guarantor sort of, I'm wondering if you think either of those things make the environment slightly more optimistic, and if you agree with anything I've said about bureaucratic stasis and the informal norms that support most of these bureaucracies that even if there is information, don't act on it. So anyway, thanks again. It was a great talk.
Suzanne.
Suzanne, hi, it's nice to see you again.
Suzanne.
Oh, Suzanne, hi, it's nice to see you again. I think you saw the first draft of this when I last presented here at the end of 2021.
Yeah.
You gave really great comments. I'm sort of sheepish when I think how it seems to have not really developed a whole lot in 2.25 years, but from the first time you saw it. But I think I'd like to think there's been a bit of progress, but I think you're right. I think there's a big problem in the financial inclusion sector and the economic inclusion sector, in my opinion, which is some donors say to policymakers, you should do financial inclusion. You need new policies. You need to support firms. And here's some money. And by the way, we've got this line for financial inclusion, and you're going to be compared against your peers to the extent that you've managed to do that. But I think one of the problems is there's a couple of emperor's new clothes going on, which is no one wants to face up to the fact that you don't get financial inclusion without trial and error. Safaricom made a lot of mistakes. Cash merchants ran out of liquidity all the time. Hollow Tractor makes a lot of mistakes. All these firms that are trying to, that's part of the way firms develop a new product. There's trial and error. Thomas Edison and his 10,000 experiments before the light bulb went off. So there's no way to avoid that, in my opinion. But a lot of policymakers, they're under pressure to do financial inclusion, but they're also under pressure to perform their other jobs, like don't let the financial system collapse. Don't let customers be mistreated. Ensure that there's adequate levels of competition. Because I think policymakers aren't given the room to vent and talk about the challenges of trying to merge those policy goals. It's just assumed you can do the lot. And I think there's a trade-off, which just isn't properly discussed. Second, on the incentive, and that goes to the incentive structure. And then in terms of donors, in my experience, there are some donors that want grand solutions. They're only interested in funding your work if they can fund it for $5 million worth and it's going to be replicated in 6 months across 12 countries. And in my view, that's just not how these bridge systems work. They start slow, then there's a mess, there's mistakes, it evolves over time. And what my hero for this work, well, I'm interested in the work of Douglas North, like you were saying. My real hero is a woman called Eleanor Ostrom, who I'm sure a lot of you know, who studied tragedy of the commons and said, actually, if you leave communities alone, often they'll manage tragedy of the commons better than if the state or firms do it. And she could only establish that point after 30 years of case studies, zoom in and study what happens at the micro level. So she's my role model for this work, to say, let's move away from grand solutions. Let's be a lot more targeted and try to uncover the spontaneous order that emerges at the micro level. I just think there's not a lot of donors often aren't interested in that sort of work until the person came up with it has won a Nobel Prize. And it's like, right, okay, we'll then fund the center you set up, Eleanor Ostrom, when you're 76 and you've been around for 40 years. But I think there's a track record of case studies before donors think this is the silver bullet. it's doing what she was doing. And third, that idea of transparency. So a lot of the way in which contracts work and the way to make contracts work better in inverted commas, is more information, particularly private information. So I'm a cash merchant, I'm not doing a great job, but no one knows, so it doesn't matter. The firm then says it's more costly for us to work with you because you've got all this private information about the good or bad you're doing, and it costs us a lot of money and resources to gather that private information on you. The media can lower that so much, because firms can gather private information on their cash merchants so much more easily, or customers complain so much more easily. And that's got its own problems: privacy, power dynamics. Or we could have a few birdies talking about that, but at least just the raw economics of it. The more that information, credible, correct information, can be circulated, in theory, the lower the transaction costs, and the better, in inverted commas, contracts can work. So I'd say broadly, these mechanisms can create new opportunities. And that's, I think, part of the reason these systems can take off. So here, the firm never sues its agents. Instead, and in fact, the farmer never sues its owner. Like, we never sue our Uber driver. Well, the Uber driver never sues us. If absolute worst comes to worst, we leave a dreadful review. There's a reputation system. So that can happen because of technology. We can develop, again, workarounds. You don't need courts with this. Well, maybe to be handy if you had them, but you don't need to sue her in court, or the farmer doesn't need to sue Hello Tractor or sue each other. They can use a rating mechanism, and that's lower cost to set up and can incentivize good behavior.
I just wondered if I could ask one quick question, which I forgot to ask, which was on the cash merchants, is one of the reasons they don't have enough money is that they're worried that they will be robbed, or is that not a factor?
That's one of the many problems. So that's what led to the aggregators, because cash merchants say, I've got all this cash in my till, I don't like that, so I'll go to a bank. Now that's fine if you're in downtown Nairobi, because the bank's 3 blocks away. But if you're in Wajir, different story. And so that was the second. Do you remember I talked in phases?
Yes.
The first phase, basic model, and there's no science between those phases. Safaricom hasn't called them that. It's just the way I try to think about it. So I sort of see it as they're trying to solve problems one after the other, or sometimes at the same time. So one of them is, we don't want to build branches, it's too costly, so we'll use cash merchants. They can use their own money for reserve, so we don't need to transfer money into rural areas. But then so that solved that problem. But then the cash merchants run out of money, so we need to solve that problem because they can't go to banks. So then we'll set up the aggregators. And there's actually a generation after that, which is then the aggregators started running out of money. So I could have talked for hours about the different levels that emerge, but they're all emerging to solve problems.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Fascinating organic development. It's really interesting. I'm afraid that we've run out of time. So shall we all give Professor Greenacre a hand? Okay, John, thank you very much. Look forward to talking about this more and seeing what else can come of it. For all of you, especially online, I want to remind that the next of the Walter Rodney Seminar Series will be held on February 5th, when Dan Connell will be back by popular demand to talk about Ethiopia and crisis, from war to peace and back again. He was there recently and has some fresh observations on the situation. Anything else before we close from anyone here? John, any?
Just thank you for having me, and I hope to see you again soon.
Okay, great. All right, thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.